Today is the first of 2 days where we will be discussing Karl Marx. Marx is considered to be one of the founders of sociology, even though he himself was not a sociologist. He might be the most controversial figure in not only sociological history, but intellectual history as well, and even in present-day political discourse. So as I said in the previous slide, Karl Marx is one of the most controversial figures in all of intellectual history, regardless of the topic, sociology, psychology, philosophy, etc. He was a revolutionary socialist who is far too radical to even be within the university. We'll get into that a little bit more in the upcoming slides. He wasn't even allowed to defend his dissertation at the University of Berlin, where he attended. He had to go to the University of Vienna. Marx is a great example and a great counter-argument to this flawed assumption. There's this flawed assumption that when we read philosophy and that we read social theory, that these things are irrelevant to the way we think about society today, that they are disconnected from, quote-unquote, the real world. Karl Marx is the most obvious counterpoint to this flawed assumption. For better or worse, depending on your opinion of him, Karl Marx shook the world. He had and has a very large influence on the shape of governments throughout both the West and the East. For better or worse, he had a huge impact on the world and is a prime example against the assumption that social theory and social philosophy are irrelevant to real-world experience. Starting with his life, starting with where he was born in the West German city of Trier. Trier is one of the most western cities in Germany. It hugs the border of Luxembourg. It is also the oldest city in Germany. There are Roman ruins there. And they have the house that Karl Marx was born in, pictured here. He was born there in 1818. This house pictured is now a museum called the Karl Marx House. They have possessions of his, and you can walk around there. If you ever find yourself in Germany, it's worth a stop. I will say that the city of Trier today is a bit depressing and a bit rough. But if you happen to be in Western Germany, Trier is definitely worth a stop. He was born to an upper middle class family. His father Heinrich was a lawyer. And here's some pictures of the Karl Marx house that I took when I was there about a year ago. In the middle there is the backyard of the Karl Marx house. In the top right corner is a picture of the chair that Marx used to write in. It is also said to be the chair that he died in. And then in the bottom left, they have Karl Marx's watch. When Karl Marx was 18, he would go to the University of Bonn. Bonn is a city that is not too far away from Trier. Marx had a problem with alcohol pretty early on in his life, a problem that he would never rid himself of. He was drinking too much as a college student, and his grades were deteriorating. He became drunk and he got injured in a fencing duel with a friend of his. His father did not like this behavior, his father being an upper middle class lawyer and valuing education, and had Karl Marx leave the University of Bonn, which was near his hometown of Trier, and had him move to the University of Berlin, which was considered the more serious university. However, Berlin is also on the other side of the country in Germany. It's very far away from his family. Marx became fascinated with Hegel, the philosopher Hegel, and particularly with his notion of dialectics as it could be introduced into our understanding of history and the understanding of society. We won't get into Hegel. That's more of a advanced class, not really meant for an introductory class. In fact, I'm convinced that many Hegel scholars themselves aren't really quite sure if they understand what Hegel is saying, so we'll push him to the side for today. However, for for many reasons, Hegel inspired young German intellectuals at that time, and young European intellectuals more generally at that time. They even would have certain groups. There were left-wing and right-wing Hegelians who had different interpretations of what Hegel was writing. Marx was a part of a group called the Young Hegelians, who were fascinated with his work. However, these were Marx's friends at a young age, though these friends of Marx would later become his enemies. As I will discuss a little bit more later on in this presentation, Marx had great difficulty in keeping friends in his life. When Marx was getting his PhD at the University of Berlin, his work proved to be too radical for the faculty there, and they would not approve of his dissertation. Academic freedom was far more constricted in the mid-19th century, probably to nobody's surprise. He had to go to the University of Vienna, which is in East German town in Thuringia, or Thüringen, to say it in the German way. Here's a picture of Vienna here. It's about 3 hours south of Berlin, and they were willing to have Marx defend his dissertation there in order for him to be able to complete his education and receive his PhD. Marx was a bit of a troublemaker, and something that started early on in his life, but would stay with him even in older age. A bit of a trickster and contrarian. One example I'll present here is his friendship with the atheist philosopher Bruno Bauer. They were good friends at a young age, though they would later grow to hate one another. They were both atheists who felt great disdain for religion, and to express their hatred for religion, they would get very drunk with one another and ride on donkeys through church gatherings to upset those attending church. Marx had a great deal of trouble keeping friends. He had a kind of prickly personality and was not a particularly kind man. The one friend he would keep throughout his life would be Friedrich Engels, who he met in 1844 when he was in his 20s. They met in a cafe where chess was played among intellectuals, and they found in their first conversation with one another that they agreed about just about everything. Engels came from money. His father owned a factory in Manchester, England. And Engels would pay Marx throughout Marx's life because Engels had the money. Marx did not have much of an income because he was getting kicked out in country after country, and he was constantly on the run, had trouble keeping a stable income. So Engels, being from money, provided him with enough to live and to sustain him and his family. So ironically, the project of communism was funded by capitalism, in that Marx was able to write what he did because of Engels' regular payments to him to be able to support his family. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels would co-author a number of works together. For example, we will be talking about the Communist Manifesto today that they co-authored with one another. Friedrich Engels said that Karl Marx was of far superior intellect to himself. Perhaps he was just being modest. Marx was a lot less orderly, however, than Engels. Marx had a great deal of difficulty meeting deadlines and having a more professional, let's say 9-to-5 work style, whereas Engels was a bit more traditional in that regard. Marx would have sessions where he would essentially binge drink for days on end and lay on the couch miserable and was unable to work, though he would get over these hangovers and then have binge writing sessions after his binge drinking sessions. He would stay up all night and write a great deal of work. When he would have trouble with meeting deadlines, Engels made many sacrifices for Marx, and one of which was that Engels would write columns for Marx and then put them under Marx's name. Engels, who was, for example, a little bit more informed when it came to foreign policy, would write very informed columns about foreign policy, which would impress many people about Marx, because even though that wasn't really in Marx's wheelhouse, they would believe that he has such a range of expertise that he's got quite a bit of he's quite flexible and knows a great deal about many topics. This was the impression, but in reality, it was simply Friedrich Engels writing the columns for him. As I mentioned in a previous slide, Engels would financially support Marx throughout his life. Engels thought Marx was a genius. He saw a great deal of potential in him and made many sacrifices for Marx, not only including writing columns on his behalf. Marx was strange, and he would do things like create a new language. He would combine German and French and English to create his own language, and Marx and Engels would write to each other in this created language. Engels took the time to sit down and learn the gibberish because he thought that Marx was such a genius and had so much respect for him that there seems to be little that Engels would not do for him. Marx, for example, cheated on his wife and with Marx's maid, and they had a son. Engels, wanting to defend Marx and wanting to defend the communist movement, which Marx was the face of, decided to say that it was actually him who had relations with the maid and that it was his son to cover up for Marx. Another quick story. It's hard to know whether or not the feeling was mutual. I mean, many people say it was, but Marx did not show. There were times where it seems that Marx did not show the same admiration for Engels. Friedrich Engels' wife, Mary Burns, died, for example, and there's a letter that Engels writes to Marx informing Marx that his wife had died. Marx responded by saying, "Why couldn't it have been my mother instead? She has had many years of her life already. She could have passed on, and that would have been better. Anyway, would you mind sending me some money? I am low on money right now." Engels became quite irritated with this response, naturally, because upon hearing that Engels' wife has died, Marx's response is to ask Engels for money. There are many examples in Marx's life where his self-interest seems to get in the way of him being able to be a normal person with friendly relationships with his close friends and family members too. Karl Marx was somewhat ridiculous in many ways. I'll provide you with one quick anecdote to exemplify this. Karl Marx loved chess. He obsessed over it so much that he thought that he had created a move to be able to beat the game of chess, meaning he thought there was a hole in the game of chess that he identified. He thought that he had created a move that would make him win every game because of this flaw in the game of chess that has never been discovered before. He won several games in a row with this move, and he invited his friends over and they had champagne to celebrate Marx's great achievement, that being finding this hole in the game of chess. Though he would later find out that he did not actually create an undefeated move, because a friend of his would defeat him in the game of chess shortly after he created it. We know this story because Karl Marx's wife, Jenny, wrote a letter to the wife of the man who beat Marx, asking her to please not have him come over and play with Karl Marx late at night, because in her words, Karl Marx becomes most disagreeable at night when he loses the game. Because of his radical and subversive writings, Marx was on the run for much of his life. He had to leave Berlin. He lived in Paris, France. He lived in London, England, and lived in Brussels as well. He spoke German, English, and French as a result, and even created his own language, which he had to convince Engels to try to learn. This is a picture of myself, actually. I was in London maybe 4 years ago. This is the apartment that Marx lived in for a bit of time. It's in this sort of insufferable area of London called Soho, where there are many bars and restaurants and whatnot. A very capitalism is booming on this street where the father of communism lived. Marx died in 1881. He is buried in London. Um, Here are a couple of pictures of his grave. There's actually on the right hand side is where he was buried, and then on the left hand side is something they built later on when he became more famous and more well known. Um, when I was there, there are several people, Marx fans, taking pictures of the grave on the left hand side. Um, Ironically, you need to pay money to get into the cemetery. I'm not sure whether or not Marx would have approved of that. And there have been many people who despise Marx, who have gone into this cemetery late at night to throw paint at the statue of Marx on the left there, to destroy it, to vandalize it in any way that they can. They've done a good job at restoring the work of these hoodlums, however. By Marx's grave at his funeral, Friedrich Engels spoke. His whole speech is actually available online. If anybody is interested in reading the speech, please email me and I will provide it to you. Engels made the prediction saying, quote, "His name will endure through the ages, and so also will his work." At the time, people thought that Engels' prediction that Marx's name will endure through the ages was actually overly optimistic about the lasting influence of Marx. They did not believe that he would be remembered forever. However, Engels was correct. Marx is today one of the most well-known philosophers in human history. If any of you would like to further explore some of Marx's life, I recommend this book to you, Karl Marx, A Life by Francis Wheen. It's not a very technical book. It's quite a breezy book, an easy read. It goes more into sort of the Karl Marx the person rather than Karl Marx the thinker, though there is the latter aspect as well. But it touches on some of the humorous aspects of his life, the ways in which Marx was rather ridiculous. Some of the details I covered in this slide, for example, come from this biography. So I highly recommend it if you do have an interest in Marx. I'd also like to recommend this movie, The Young Karl Marx, that came out about 7 years ago. It's mostly historically accurate, to my surprise. Probably the one inaccuracy is that Karl Marx, the actor playing Karl Marx here, is quite handsome, whereas Karl Marx, the man, the real man, was known not to be. However, this is quite a good movie. It covers his life when he's in France, England, and Germany. So the movie is in German, is spoken in German, English, and French. They found actors who could speak all three languages. There's English subtitles throughout, and I will provide a link for this movie at the end of this slide, where you could watch it for free. We will now turn to the manifesto of the Communist Party. It should be known that this manifesto is quite a bit easier to read than some of other Marx's writings. It was a pamphlet meant for workers to read, so the language is more accessible and easier to understand than, say, Marx's contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. Intended to be accessible, beginning with sort of journalistic language, talking about the very first line saying that there is a specter haunting Europe. A specter, if you don't know, is just a ghost. There is a specter, a ghost, an unwanted spirit haunting Europe. And Marx says that this specter is communism. Unwanted meaning unwanted by the ruling class, not unwanted by Marx and Engels. He claims that communism is spreading and taking over the continent of Europe. Some scholars believe that this is sort of an exaggeration, and it's a strategy to make it seem that the movement of communism is much more successful than it actually was at the time, It's a way of trying to frame communism as something that is gaining traction with the hopes that more people would be willing to see a potential opportunity in communism and join it. It's a presentation of the movement gaining traction to help the movement gain more traction. Central to the Communist Manifesto and much of Marx's writings is at the very bottom of this page, on page 473, where he says, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Human history can be understood as being fundamental to it, I should say, could be understood as revolving around class struggles." Turning to page 474 now and expounding upon this idea that the history of human societies are the history of class struggles. Karl Marx claims that, in a word, this is the history between the oppressor and the oppressed. He writes, quote, "In the earlier epochs of history, we find almost everywhere a complicated arrangement of society into various orders, a manifold gradation of social rank." He then provides us with several examples. In ancient Rome, we have patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves. In the Middle Ages, feudal lords, vassals, guild masters, journeymen, apprentices, serfs. In almost all of these classes, again, subordinate gradations. He goes on to talk about how these subordinate gradations apply to the current state that they were writing in the 1840s, saying that this is between this class struggle has simplified to two classes that stand in an antagonistic relation to one another, particularly the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So the bourgeoisie are the owners of the means of production, whereas the proletariat represent the working class, who the bourgeoisie exploit to be able to earn more capital. The bourgeoisie have essentially sucked the world of all its meaning, according to Marx. They have drowned anything of sentimental value, anything of personal worth, anything related to human happiness and human value has been drowned in mere capital, in mere egotistical calculation, cash payment, exchange value. On page 475, right at the bottom paragraph there, he says that the bourgeoisie have left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of sentimentalism, in the icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value. There's sort of a interesting contradictory treatment of the bourgeoisie here in the Communist Manifesto. Of course, they are being described in negative terms of, essentially drowning society of anything sentimental and valuable, etc., and creating a great deal of exploitation for the proletariat, the working class. However, of course, Marx and Engels note that there's great achievements that the bourgeoisie have experienced. They have globalized in a way through their capitalist success that has allowed what they say a considerable part of the population to be rescued from the idiocy of rural life. Marx and Engels were themselves metropolitan men who, although sort of philosophers of the working class, also were quite arrogant in a very stereotypical city-like way. They looked down at the rural population. Francis Wheen, who we mentioned earlier in these slides, his biographer, actually lives in a very rural part of England and makes a funny anecdote in the introduction of his in the introduction of his biography of Marx, writing that he himself hails from the rural idiocy, as Marx and Engels put it. To Marx and Engels, workers who engage in this system are essentially stripping themselves of their humanity. They have to live in these terrible working conditions where they don't have any time to develop their own individual skills, their own individual character. They work for other people and they don't work toward their own, let's say, existential nourishment. They have to essentially become an extension of a machine because the tasks of their labor are so monotonous, they're so boring, they're so simple that they are unable under these conditions to develop any valuable skills themselves. Their only purpose is to tirelessly work for the bourgeoisie, performing these monotonous tasks, these non-specialized tasks, and their work, even though it only provides them with enough money to survive, essentially, enough money for them to be able to grab a small bit of food and maybe have some shelter. They are essentially working toward their own exploitation. They do it to be able to survive, but they also are in their work contributing toward the success of the bourgeoisie. And as Marx and Engels describe it, the bourgeoisie's only aim is to further and further oppress the proletariat, though they need the proletariat in order for them to be successful, which is why they provide them with only means of subsistence, meaning only enough for them to barely survive so that they could show up to work the next day. Reading in the top right corner on page 479, Marx and Engels say, these laborers who must sell themselves piecemeal are commodity like every other article of commerce, and are consequently exposed to all of the vicissitudes of competition, to all the fluctuations of the market. Owing to the extensive use of machinery and to division of labor, the work of the proletarians has lost all individual character, and consequently all charm for the workman. He becomes an appendage of the machine, and it is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. Hence, the cost of production of a workman is restricted almost entirely to the means of subsistence that he requires for his maintenance, etc., etc. Marx and Engels are quite hopeful. There's a great deal of depressing descriptions of working conditions and exploitation and how human sentimentalism is drowning in egotistical calculation. There are great problems to identify as they see it. However, they are hopeful that the bourgeoisie are actually about to destroy themselves unintentionally. The nature of their work and the nature of their advancement requires a sort of globalization that is allowing the proletariat to make stronger connections with one another. As they say on page 481, the real fruit of their battle lies not in the immediate result, but in the ever-expanding union of the workers. This union is helped on by the improved means of communication that are created by modern industry. And that place the workers of different localities in contact with one another. Modern industry is essentially creating a more competent and connected proletariat, and it is in these connections that the bourgeoisie have unintentionally created as they pursue more capital, where Marx and Engels see an opportunity for organizing a revolution. Later on the same page they write, in all these battles it sees itself compelled to appeal to the proletariat, that meaning the bourgeoisie see themselves compelled to appeal to the proletariat, to ask for its help, and thus to drag it into the political arena. The bourgeoisie itself, therefore, supplies the proletariat with its own elements of political and general education. In other words, it furnishes the proletariat with weapons for fighting the bourgeoisie. Communism's main objective is to abolish all private property that is creating this destruction and exploitation in the world. Communism, they do briefly consider some counter arguments to the position, though not many. It's a rather short pamphlet. And frankly, the very first counter argument that they consider, they claim is not really worthy of serious examination. The arguments against communism from the religious standpoint, for example, they regard as being so infantile that they're not even going to respond to it. On the same page, they talk. This is a pretty central part of consciousness as understood by Marx and epistemology, that human beings' ideas and our very consciousness and our ability to think and experience the world change with material existence. It is not ideas that drive society for Marx. He has a more reflective understanding, a top-down understanding, where society and material existence dictates how we see the world, our ideas, how we produce our ideas, and the overall shape and product that is human consciousness. He believes that driving this material existence are the ideas of the ruling class. We will talk more about how this connects to religion from his contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. But today he doesn't really get into that in the Communist Manifesto. However, ruling class ideas, given the fact that they are in a more favored role in society, are able to dictate not only material existence in a society, but also the existence of our very ideas, the existence of the way human beings experience the world and think about it. Communism is supposed to be radical in both not only in terms of material conditions, but as a consequence, it will be radical in the overall shape of how human beings think, human consciousness. It therefore not only abolishes all private property, which is its main objective, however, abolishes all religion, all past morality. Communism is seen as breaking away from all past human experience, both materially and at the level of ideas. Turning to page 490, the goal in abolishing private property means to centralize the means of production into the hands of the state, to allow the state to take over all private property. In this goal on page 490, he lays out a list of 10 aspects of what would come with a communist society. Yeah, some have called them the 10 Commandments, to be provocative and ironic. On 490, I'll read them here, starting with the abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. Commandment number 2, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Number 3, abolition of all right of inheritance. Number 4, confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. Number 5, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. Number 6, centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Number 7, extension of factories and instruments for production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wastelands and the improvement of the soil, generally in accordance with a common plan. Number 8, equal liability of all to labor, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. Number 9, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the population over the country. And finally, number 10, free education for all children in public schools, abolition of children's factory labor in its present form, combination of education with industrial production, etc., etc. And as we reach the final paragraphs of the Communist Manifesto, some matters are reiterated. The revolutionary nature of the Communist Manifesto in terms of trying to move against all existing social and political order. It is therefore a forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions, all of the problems and the exploitation that Marx and Engels lay out. We are not going to try to reform it. We are trying to create a revolution, they say. They don't want to simply find ways to improve the current system. They want to destroy the current system. They want to, at its very roots, at its very foundation, completely transform it, completely break away from all that has existed before. Basically, throw the playbook away and start all over. Throw everything away and burn it to the ground and start again. This is not a matter of improvement. It's a matter of revolution. Again, like I said before, they write in very dramatic and journalistic terms, particularly in the Communist Manifesto, which was again meant for to be read by the working class, not to be read necessarily by scholars. It is trying to be motivating and to sort of tug at the reader's heartstrings to an extent. It is for this reason that they say things like "Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution." I will, I'll just read the very final paragraph here. They say, "Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite." Here are two links that are optional, though I definitely encourage you to take a look at both of them. In the first link, it's an interview on C-SPAN between Francis Wynne, with Francis Wynne, who, like I said, is the biographer of Karl Marx. And he breaks down what his biography is about. He talks a great deal about Marx in his life. He's a very knowledgeable English journalist. And in the second link, if you'd like, you could watch The Young Karl Marx, the movie I mentioned at the beginning, that came out a few years ago. You could watch it on Internet Archive for free. And yeah, I encourage you to do so. Thank you very much for listening to this lecture and have a good day.